Well, Diane always says Dr. B, so at least I didn't go there.
And whatever works.
Okay, so. Do the flyer.
Thank you for joining us early. We'll start at 10. I'm going to go ahead and share my slides, but thanks for coming to this webinar. If you want to, please, introduce yourself in the chat and say where you're calling from. Like I would say, Diane, Houston, Texas.
I think you're muted, Diane.
Oh, my bad. But I just sent where I'm from in the chat. If anybody wants to participate and tell us where they're from, that would be cool just to see where everybody's at.
Dr. Burnett, if you don't mind my asking, are you originally from Houston? Are you a Houston native?
A little bit north of Houston, so I grew up actually in the New Caney and Porter area. So just about 35 miles north of Houston.
Okay, but a forever Texan.
Yep, except for I went to Louisiana for a little bit, but that was for school. That was about 1.5 years, and then I came back. So other than that.
Got back to Texas as fast as you could.
Well, yeah. It was fun out there. I had a good time, but it was time to get back.
Oh yeah, I bet. So you got LSU out there?
No, I went to University of Louisiana Monroe for experimental psych program. And the reason I went there is because I met the director, the chair at a conference, and he was drinking a Guinness beer. I sat next to him, we started talking. He said, "Hey, where are you going for grad school?" I said, "I don't know, I haven't thought about it." He said, "Why don't you come out here, we can pay for it." And I said, "I'll see you there." So Guinness beer got me a scholarship. So
yeah, okay.
Yeah, never even knew of the school, but I was like, I'm there.
Yeah, but I'll go anywhere if you pay for it.
That's right.
That's awesome.
Okay, so it looks like it's 10. I'm going to go ahead and get started. That way there's plenty of time for the presentation, and also hopefully there's going to be time for questions after. Thank you for everyone for joining us today. It's Older Americans Month. Theme is Aging Unbound. This is our last webinar of the month. Thank you for joining us. If you've joined us before, thanks for returning. So I have to do my little spiel about what SMP is. So who is SMP? Our mission is to empower and assist Medicare beneficiaries, families, caregivers to prevent, detect, and report healthcare fraud, errors, and abuse through outreach, counseling, and education. So like we're doing today, we do a lot of presentations around Medicare fraud, how to protect yourself and protect others. So with the Senior Medicare Patrol, we're a federally funded program. There's one in every state in the United States and 4 territories, so there's 54 Senior Medicare Patrols. We recruit and train volunteers and professionals about Medicare fraud and abuse. So if anybody's interested in becoming a volunteer, our volunteer coordinators on the line here too. So please, we need your help in the state to protect our beneficiaries and other older adults and anybody that's on Medicare from fraud. And we have a hotline. So please call our hotline. It's a toll-free number to report intentional fraud and abuse. What we do with your information, it's confidential. We'll report to the OIG, the Office of Inspector General. We'll report to Medicare. We'll report to basically anybody who needs to hear it on your behalf. We are not investigators, so we won't investigate the case. We basically just collect information and send it off to the proper authorities. I'm going to read our hotline number out loud. It's 888-341-6187. That's 888-341-6187. So together we can stop Medicare fraud. We do this through prevention, detection, and reporting, as I mentioned. So to prevent Medicare fraud, know what scams to look out for. So be aware of the scams that are going on. You can do this by checking out our website, attending our presentations, and calling our hotline just for information. Right now, the biggest scam that we're seeing are COVID-19 tests. So what scammers will do is they will basically bill Medicare and send beneficiaries 10s, 20, 30 COVID tests that they did not ask for. And my theory is because the public health emergency is ending, so they're trying to get in as many as they can. So right now, beneficiaries are calling with all these tests that may have even been expired that they didn't ask for. If that happens, please call our hotline. We'll help with the reporting. Don't answer calls from unknown numbers. Medicare will never ever call you on the phone. Don't give out your personal information to anyone over the phone. Honestly, if you don't recognize the number, just don't answer it. Important calls will leave voicemail. Never let someone you don't know into your home, and then keep your Medicare number secure. Keep your card at home when you don't need it. A lot of people are concerned about if they get into an accident when they're out and about or traveling. The hospital can get your information later if you do end up, getting into some trouble. They can always bill later. So don't carry that around, act like it's a social security card. Then detect. Tracking your healthcare visits for services received. We have something called a healthcare tracker, which you can call us for the hotline, and we can send you one in the mail. So you use that basically to keep track of your doctor's visits and compare them to your Medicare summary notices and any bills that you receive. Cross-checking with your Medicare summary notices, and then review your Medicare summary notices often, every time they come in the mail, or if you check them online. You're your first line of defense. So if you don't keep track of it, nobody else honestly will. So please keep track of your Medicare summary notices. Make sure that all the claims that you're getting are things that you actually receive, and then report. Report any suspected fraud or abuse to call your healthcare provider if you see something fishy, your insurance provider, and then you can call our hotline. If you suspect it, I just said, call your healthcare provider. Not everything is fraud. Sometimes, billing codes can get very confusing. So check with your healthcare provider first if they made a mistake. And then you can call us at the Texas Senior Medicare Patrol, and this is our hotline number, 888-341-6187. We don't have, it's not a robot that you don't have to press 1, 2, 3, whatever. You'll get a real person unless we're already on the phone with someone else, or it's after hours, and we'll try to get you the next business day. And so now I'm going to introduce Dr. Jason Burnett. He's with McGovern Medical School at UT Health. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and he's going to take over. I'm going to turn off my camera just to save bandwidth. And feel free to ask questions in the chat. Dr. Burnett, do you want us to ask as we go if people have questions, or do you want to wait till the end?
Probably, well, it doesn't matter. We can do it either way. At the end is probably better.
Okay, then we can do it at the end. We can do it at the end. If you have questions, feel free to either drop them in the chat or put them in the Q&A section. There's an anonymous option for the Q&A session. So if you don't want people to know you asked, that's perfectly fine too. And so I will stop talking now.
All right. So can Thank you, Diane. Can everyone see my slides?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, cool. Let me just make sure I can advance like I want to. All right, there we go. All right, so thank you everyone for joining. I wish we were all together in a nice room, but unfortunately, unfortunately, we're not able to be. Unfortunately, in the sense that it's really nice to be together to have more time to talk about these things and to sort of see your reaction, see where we're headed in terms of content things, but it's also sort of fortunate that we're able to meet this way also, and not leave out rural areas and other people that may be very interested in this who may not be localized to Houston where I'm at. So it's always the pluses and negatives, but what I hope to do today is to cover some information that I think is you'll find interesting. I know the Surgeon General of the United States finds it interesting, not because he's seen this presentation. He may not find this presentation interesting, but he definitely has put out a report recently, which you probably all read, and it's all about social connection, loneliness, isolation, and the problem that we're facing in our society across the globe with a lot of older adults, but also younger adults, people all across the lifespan who are experiencing just sort of some social disconnection, some loneliness, some isolation. And so we'll cover quite a bit of ground today, but what I really want to do is highlight some differences in social isolation, loneliness, give you some background statistics, and then also talk some about why it's bad for our health, but then really focus on the scalable solutions that we have out there that are available, that are being built in our communities, so we can address these issues. But before I move on to the next slide, one thing I want to say is, if you've heard me talk about this, you've probably seen this face slide before, and I just really, I've got to start looking for different face slides, but this slide conveys so much about loneliness, isolation, and I should present it at the end maybe, so you can then say, oh, now I see why this person may look like this, why it makes so much sense, but I'll cover it really quickly. Now, if you really take a look at this photo, this was something that I think came out, probably right before COVID, but it really gave this older gentleman who's looking at some photo, who knows what, if he's looking at family, friends, a loved one, maybe could be looking at his grandchildren. He's holding a teddy bear, he looks really sad. He's got bags under his eyes, probably hasn't been sleeping as much. His clothes aren't fitting. If you look really closely at that right leg, both legs actually, you see sort of the bones sticking out, weight loss. And so these are also really important indicators that somebody may be lonely and isolated. We're going to talk about why that is, but a lot of folks, when they're lonely and isolated, they have some really, really bad health outcomes. So before I get into it, I don't have any conflicts of interest, so I just want to highlight that. And here's just some basic landscape of where we're headed. We're going to differentiate social isolation and loneliness. A lot of times those things get conflated. So we want to be able to really understand what the differences are there. We'll talk about some percentages of aged adults living with loneliness, isolation in the U.S. We'll talk about the healthcare or the health effects of these sort of circumstances, and then some underlying pathways, and then we'll cover some evidence-based and scalable approaches that can facilitate social connection in our communities. Where I want to start is with solitude. When you see reports like, oh, there's a problem with isolation, loneliness, everybody's socially isolated, everybody's lonely, it's bad for our health. Well, we don't want to kick solitude to the curb. And if you read the Surgeon General's report, you'll see in there that he actually talks about solitude a little bit. And like anything, solitude is this aspect where we're able to return to ourselves. If you've ever just been super tired at the end of the day, which I guarantee we all have, you're like, I don't want to talk to anybody. I want to just go home. I want to sit down and just decompress. And if you're doing that, what you're doing is you're choosing solitude. You're choosing to remove yourself from other folks and just sort of get recentered with yourself. And sometimes maybe it's, I'm going to take a trip for a week by myself. I'm going to spend a certain amount of time by myself. And it's not a bad thing. You know, if I was to say, oh, solitude is terrible, then I would need to go take all my, you know, really all my favorite records, all, you know, all the classical greats, kick them, you know, throw them in the trash, because like Mozart and those folks, they spent a lot of time in solitude writing their things. And that's where you can have this really creative space. But you know, it can turn bad just like anything else. But let's think about when we get the greatest amount of solitude. Well, it's when we're sleeping. When we're sleeping, you know, the body goes into sort of paralysis. It's, you know, we're completely alone in this situation. And yet, what happens when we sleep? We start to heal, we start assimilating ideas, our body is regenerating. So solitude can be a very positive thing. But just like anything else, we have to have caution around it, because if we go and remove ourselves and go to solitude for too long, well, bad things can happen. And just like anything, we want to consider, you know, sort of moderation when it comes to being alone. And we're going to talk about why that is. But before we do, let's think about exercise. We hear about, oh, you know, exercise. This is how we improve our brain function, our mental health, how we keep from getting Alzheimer's disease. It helps us control our weight, gives us strong bones and muscles, helps our heart, helps our lungs, reduce our risk of falls. But guess what? Too much of it can be harmful for you. So if you've ever heard of rhabdomyolysis, you can work out too much, all of a sudden your body's like, hey, that was way too much. Your body has a negative reaction, negative effect, and it shuts your kidneys down, all kinds of stuff. So my point of saying all this is that it can be very harmful to us to do things in excess. And when I'm talking about that, I'm really speaking more towards being isolated for too long. So, you know, this is a slide where just sort of illustrating when good things are made bad, right? So solitude, being alone, if that's what you're choosing and that's what you want to do, and it's not because of, you know, some sort of trauma, if you're really choosing that, oh, I want to be alone for a while, that's okay, because you're choosing to do that. But if someone is to put you into solitude, which we see with Alzheimer's treatment, others kind of scenarios, or when we have these health conditions and all of a sudden we can't get out and do things that we want to do, it can be very negative for our health. So there was a study done where they actually took these mice, they put them in a cage, they had these exercise wheels, and each mouse exercised the same intensity for the same amount of time at the same time. However, the caveat is, or the difference was that when one mouse had the ability to control all of that, the other mouse didn't. So when the experimental mouse went in there, however fast it worked out, however long, whatever intensity, whenever it happened, that's when the other one had to do it at the same amount. So there's a lot of uncertainty around it. And what ended up happening was the one that was choosing to exercise and do all that stuff got the benefits of exercise. The one that wasn't had the same amount of exercise and everything, but had some negative effects. And so if you think about that in terms of social isolation, loneliness, solitude, you sort of see the parallels of, if we have some control over it, it can be a good thing. If we don't have some control over it, it can turn into a very negative thing. So this is where we start talking about social connection. And when we think about social connection, there's a lot of different terms you hear out there: community engagement, social support, social integration, social networks, dyads, couples, social strain, loneliness. I mean, there's just a lot of terminology. And for a long time, it's, you know, and when you look in the literature now, you'll see that it gets, you know, people may use certain terms, they don't really mean that term, they mean something else. So we're having to really, to understand this, we're having to clean up that language and start really trying to study the social isolation loneliness through things like social connection frameworks. So we need to start putting things into categories so we really understand what it means by social connection. So then if we understand that, we can start maybe understand why somebody may be lonely, isolated, so we can do interventions. So when we think about social connection, it's really the extent to which an individual is socially connected. It depends on multiple factors. And you got structural, functional, and quality. And under the structural, you'll see marital status, social integration, living alone, social isolation. And what you may notice right there, something that immediately jumps out to me, is a lot of times people will say, they're socially isolated because they live alone. But that's not necessarily true. You can live alone and still have a great network of people. So that takes us into the functional category, where you can have people around you who are coming in and they're providing you with support. Maybe they're coming in and talking to you and saying, hey, have you taken your medicine? Which, did you eat today? Did you do this? Did you do this? And they're helping you do those things, but that may not be the support that you really want. It's functional, but if there's a mismatch between the type of support you want and the type you're getting, especially in terms of social connection, then that's where you end up with perhaps being lonely. And so then we move over to this category of quality. We can, 33% of people who are married report being lonely. So that's a quality issue. You've got the structural, they're married. They got somebody in their life that, maybe provides them with some level of support, but yet that quality piece is missing. And therefore, they don't have what you would consider to be a good, strong social connection that they want. Now, some things to consider is being alone versus being lonely. They're different. So being alone does not constitute being lonely. Some folks really enjoy being alone and they don't feel lonely, and that's totally fine. They're not the same thing. And then people who are lonely may not always be alone. If you look at this picture, there's a bunch of people around that person right in the center, but they can still be very lonely because maybe the support that they're getting or the people around them, maybe it's not quality, maybe it's just they need some more emotional support, or they're looking for informational type of support and they're not getting it, so they can still feel very alone. So when we think about social isolation, loneliness, social isolation, if you go from the left to the right on this screen, we move from something that's objective to something that's subjective. So social isolation is really the objective measure of our connections, families, friends, and community. When you talk to somebody and say, how many people did you talk to this week? How many people did you talk to last week? How many people are you connected to? Those things can be quantified in a pretty direct, objective way. You can look at how many times, who they talked to on the phone. You can look at who they interacted with. But when it comes to the loneliness aspect, that's subjective. That's that assessment of, are there social relationships that I want that I don't have? And so the difference between social isolation and loneliness, one's objective, the other is subjective. So how do we define social isolation? What really, it's refers to a complete or near lack of contact with society. So once again, if somebody says, oh, they live alone, that doesn't mean they don't have people they're interacting with. But when you find those folks that are living alone, that don't have anybody they're interacting with, then you're starting to say, okay, this person is socially isolated, because it is quantifiable. And then when it comes to loneliness, we can think of it in several different ways. So if we start at the bottom left corner, remember I talked about it being subjective, right? It's this subjective component of the objective measure of social isolation. So you can say I'm connected with 50 people. However, I can still feel very lonely because maybe those 50 people aren't giving me what I need in terms of social connection. And then from the social category here, it's simply the discrepancy between what I desire and what I actually have in terms of social connection. Now, on the emotional side, we can have people we talk to and connect with, but if we're not able to share sort of emotional and have that sort of empathy-based sort of communication back and forth, we may still feel very lonely. And then we can also think about loneliness as a social pain. And what I like to equate that to is, whenever, let's say you're walking through the house, and we've all done it, we've kicked something with our shoe off and it hurt really bad. We want the pain to go away immediately, like, oh, this is terrible. That hurt. Well, with loneliness, when we feel like we're alone, it creates this need, this need. We want that to go away. It's an uneasy feeling that we have. We don't want it to go away. So we can consider that as a social pain that we want to get rid of. And now you can imagine how somebody who may be very lonely, whether they're isolated or not, and then somebody calls them up on the phone and says, hey, Jason, how you doing? Oh, I'm doing good. And then all of a sudden they befriend this person that they've never met before. Then they're sending them gift cards. They're accepting whatever it is. And so they're doing that because they're like, hey, I'll sacrifice a little bit because I want this. I want to have a social connection. So we can, and there's a lot of studies out there, or not a lot, but there's quite a few studies now that are showing that loneliness leads to increased risk of fraud and scams and other types of exploitation. Let's talk about perception as being the lens of reality. When we think about loneliness and isolation, if we feel like we're alone, well then that's our reality. But the reality in society is that it's a really big problem. And when the Surgeon General is stepping out saying, hey, we've got an epidemic of loneliness and isolation on our hands, people start to listen because he doesn't generally put out things that are just sort of off the cuff. They spent 2 years working on this one document to get it right. And if you get a chance to read it, I would read it because it really lays out the landscape, the problem that we're facing with social isolation and loneliness in our country. But we can lay some groundwork there for you. In terms of older adults in our country, approximately about 54 million adults over 65 in the US. That's a large number, and it's increasing every day. And at some point, you've probably all seen the graph, or at some point we're gonna have more older adults than we do younger children. So the landscape is shifting, but we're also going to see that we're moving in some directions that maybe we should be moving in terms of social connection. So 1 in 5 older adults live alone or are socially isolated. Okay, so that's roughly 20%, but actually the number's more like 28%, and then in certain areas it's even higher. Like in Houston, I think I was talking with Tammy Mermelstein, if any of y'all know her. She's like, hey, in Houston, like 40% of older adults are living alone. That's a high number. And if you just take this sort of 20% on a national level, that's 10 million people who are living alone or are socially isolated. Now, 2 in 5, 60 plus report feeling lonely. So we're talking about 20 million. And then in terms of meaningful connections, 2 in 5 sometimes or always feel their relationships are not meaningful. So that's another 20 million. So can you imagine, just for a second, you feel like you don't have any meaningful relationships in your life. That's a very lonely place to be in such a big world. And it's so profound because we've got all these abilities now to connect with each other through telephone, through video phone, through all these apps, all these things, but yet we're not doing it. And a lot of people are living out there going, I just don't have any meaningful relationship. And if you don't feel like you have any meaningful relationships, it can lead to some really bad things. But in terms of why people are at increased risk of loneliness and isolation, I don't think these will surprise you. Death of a spouse, or having a spouse that all of a sudden you were the sole caretaker of and you can't take care of. Now you got to move them to some sort of home, and therefore you're there by yourself. That's a big change. It's a really big change that can lead to feeling lonely and isolated. And then death of others as we get older. Our networks are shrinking. and maybe, we're retiring, there's people that get institutionalized, or we may get institutionalized. Now we're in an environment maybe we don't want to be in, so we sort of withdraw, become lonely, become isolated. Our health sort of impairs us. Maybe we have impaired mobility, hearing and vision. These are big ones. Hearing and vision are huge. I've got my father-in-law, he lives with us in the garage apartment, and doesn't want to engage because he can't hear. And we're like, hey, here's some hearing aids. Doesn't want to wear them. Therefore, he would just rather not engage. And that's a tough thing to deal with. And so just that sort of little thing of not being able to hear so well can make people sort of recluse and then not be engaged. There's some other trends that are happening though that we really should think about. And when I was younger, and I'm not too old just yet, but I remember, we would go places with extended family. We would take cars like this Suburban here, and I love it. It's an exaggeration, but it really is it's sort of reflective of how things used to be. You'd go travel with these sort of extended families. There'd be a lot of people. I think of National Lampoon Vacation. They go pick the grandmother up, and unfortunately it didn't work out so well. But they're all going. They got the station wagon. They're all piled in there. They got the dog and everybody. Well, now what we're doing is we're moving towards taking family vacation. We can all fit in this little smart car, or this little car here. So things are changing. And I don't know that they're changing in the best ways, and the trends show that they're not. We're moving from these sort of multi-generational houses to people saying, "Oh, I want to live in a tiny house." Well, it'd be interesting to see sort of how that all trends in terms, after COVID, because I don't know if everybody saw the sort of meme that used to go out there where they would show the house in the woods, and they would say, okay, for $1 million, would you live here for a month or a year by yourself? And everybody's like, yes, I would love it. And then COVID hit, and people were like, oh my gosh, I need to get out of the house. I don't want to be alone anymore. I want to be around people. So maybe that meme, or maybe COVID has changed the minds of people, but really, we are just seeing these sort of changes from these big multi-generational families to people just wanting to sort of be by themselves. We also see a lot more divorce, see fewer children being born. We're seeing, increased disability. Perhaps that's because all we do all day is walk around on concrete in every building that we go into, every street we're on, no cushion. Our orthopedic surgeons are probably like, hey, keep putting these parking garages and all this concrete because, well, it's good for them. But for us, with increased disability and seeing people being divorced, having smaller families, fewer children, well, what we also see is that the pool of family caregivers is shrinking, and that's not good for us, because if we're aging alone out there, don't have anybody to provide that sort of functional support, well, it's going to put us in a bad situation. And we're also seeing some other trends in terms of social connection. So if we look from 2003 to 2020. You start here at the left, this top left box. Social isolation has increased 24 hours per month. Okay, so you may go, well, that's not that much, but what we're doing is we're seeing that there is an increase in social isolation from 2003 to 2020. Household family social engagement has decreased 5 hours per month. Our companionship hours has gone down 14 hours per month. Our social engagement with friends has gone down 20 hours per month. I was just telling somebody, they asked me, hey, how's your buddy doing? I was like, I don't know, I haven't talked to him in a week and a half. We used to talk every day. It's just that things are busy, and unfortunately we lose connection a little bit. Non-household family social engagement down 6.5 hours a month, and then social engagement with others down 10 hours a month. So we're seeing consistent trends that we're becoming more socially disconnected. And what that means is we're moving from, if you look at this box on the left, on the left, you see these older women who are sitting around, they look like they're, I mean, they're older and they look like they're laughing, they're having fun, looks like a nice community. And now we're moving over to what may be more indicative of our society, which is this box to the right, where she's sort of walking along. You see she has a cane, she probably has some mobility issues, and just doesn't look as fun and as healthy as what's happening on the left there. And so if you've ever heard of blue zones, there's these areas like in Okinawa, Japan, Sardinia, Italy, Costa Rica, Greece, Loma Linda, California, where social connection is really, really strong. Their social fabric there has not become, we haven't started to break it down there. They really have strong social connection. They have good diets, all these things. And what you find is those people are really, really happy. They don't have sort of, the loneliness, isolation that we have. They don't, they have better sort of function, cognition. You see all these great benefits, but one of the biggest factors they have is they stay really socially connected in those blue zones. And so why should we care about all this? Why should we care if people are isolated or lonely? Well, it's happening a lot, as we've already discussed. It's deadly. It leads to bad health outcomes. But what sort of bad health outcomes? And if you've read the Surgeon General's report, or if you've ever heard a lecture on this sort of topic, you've probably heard that loneliness and isolation are equal to smoking 15 cigarettes per day in terms of health risks. That's pretty astounding. When you think about exercise and heart disease, exercise is very beneficial for you, especially for your heart, but also if you're not doing it, it's going to put you at great risk for cardiovascular disease. Social isolation, loneliness also increase your risk for cardiovascular disease by about 29%. Then obesity. We've been talking about obesity, smoking, exercise for as long as I've sort of been in public health and way beyond that. Yet, what do? Is we go, hey, we put all these programs in, but yet loneliness, social isolation puts us at risk for metabolic syndromes, much like obesity. And actually, what we do know is that loneliness, isolation put us at higher risk for bad outcomes than physical inactivity and obesity. And then the one that I don't have on here is that social isolation, loneliness also puts us at similar health risk as air pollution. Now in 2012, there was a study done. So this is, this isn't like, hey, COVID hit and here was this problem of social isolation, loneliness. This has been a problem much, prior to COVID, long time prior to COVID, it was a problem. It's just that COVID really, with all the social distancing and stuff, we really got to see the effects of extreme isolation and loneliness. But in 2012, Dr. Christinoto from UCSF, she did a study and she showed that loneliness in older persons is a predictor of functional decline and death. So let's see what she found. So what she found was that if you were lonely versus not lonely, over the 6 years, what you ended up doing is you had pretty much a twofold increase in the likelihood of having some sort of ADL impairment. So if you go to that bottom box, what you see is that you also have almost a twofold increase in the likelihood of dying over that 6 years. And that's pretty astounding when you think of, well, I mean, they're just like what you hear is, oh, they're just lonely, they're, they live alone, they're lonely, what, no big deal. What is a huge deal for our health. And in a minute, we're going to talk about why that may be. But before we get there, we know that when we're lonely, it changes our behaviors. Maybe we become depressed, apathetic. Maybe we don't think as good as we usually do. We may have high rates of pain, anxiety. And so we end up having higher risk for medication use and also medication misuse. We also see that when you're lonely, when you have isolation, what ends up happening is you start ending up having some cognitive impairment, or you have a higher risk of cognitive impairment over time. And in 2019, just before the COVID came out, COVID hit us and shut down and changed our world. The National Academies of Science, Engineering, Medicine put out this report. And it was really a call for the healthcare system. It said, hey, we've got this problem. These older adults, they interact with y'all more than anybody. They're not unlike children, they're not going to school, but they are going to the doctor, a lot of them. And what they reported is they went through and they did this census report, reviewed all the literature. They said, look, premature, loneliness, isolation are equivalent to all-cause death that rivals smoking, obesity, physical inactivity, which we talked about. It puts people at a 50% increased risk of dementia, 29% increased risk of heart disease, 32% increased risk of stroke, higher rates of depression, anxiety, suicide. And for people that have heart failure, if they have heart failure, they get sent home, they're at 4 times risk of death, 68% risk of hospitalization, and 57% risk of another ED visit if they're socially isolated and lonely. And so why does this occur? Well, one of my favorite books, when I start kind of getting away from myself, I go back and read this book and by Viktor Frankl, and I imagine quite a few of you have read it, but it's called Man's Search for Meaning. And in that book, he says, an abnormal reaction to an abnormal situation is normal behavior. So we may think that, oh my gosh, why is it that when we're alone or isolated and we're lonely, why does it lead to bad health outcomes? Well, because by nature, we're built for social connection. We've lived in communities for a long time. It helps us survive. And, and so when we don't have that, it starts changing it can change DNA. They've shown that it changes your immune system, those sorts of things. And so it actually isn't that, oh my God, this is a weird reaction. It's actually a very normal sort of reaction because we're in a situation that is very abnormal for us. So why does this happen? Well, when we get isolated and lonely, it triggers our, part of our brain, the hypothalamus, which controls our homeostasis. So it starts saying, hey, something has happened and we need to trigger some responses. So what it does, it tells our master gland, our pituitary gland, hey, you need to send out these hormones because we need to do something. And that something is generally fight or flight. And if you've ever been in a fight or flight situation, it's hard to determine which, you can't really discriminate much from it. You're either gonna, you've got all this energy and you got to do something. You're either going to run or you're going to stay. You're either going to act or just completely, sort of freeze and give up. But basically what happens is our brain starts telling us, hey, we're lonely, isolated. It tells our adrenal glands to kick up some hormones. And all of a sudden, we might be on this circle where we're very stressed out. Our hormones get released. Stress hormones increase our heart rate, blood pressure, blood sugar. This increases our, these things called glucocorticoids, which help, push down our immune system. But, and all that's done because that fight or flight is like, look, we need to get out of here. We need to do something to survive. We're not worried about our immune system in this really, in this time frame, or this time point. But if we stay on this sort of loop long enough, what ends up happening is we start getting inflammation, increased inflammation. Then we start having the effects of vascular resistance, cerebral vascular disease. We can have strokes, start having diabetes, cancer, depression, frailty, all of these just because we're on this loop of stress. And what we know is that people who are socially isolated and lonely, they have increased stress and anxiety. And we think it's because it falls along this axis. And whenever we think about what can happen, well, think about some of the people that you've served out in the community. You've got people who all of a sudden they're like, their cognitive performance isn't as good. Maybe you go to meet them and they're really pessimistic and it's doom and gloom. And maybe that's because they've shifted in terms of, when they've been lonely, been isolated, all of a sudden they become very depressed and everything's just bad, and it doesn't matter, they don't like anybody. And let's say you're going in there and you're there to do something really good for them. You have really honest intentions. And while you're there, they're giving you all this sort of grief and they don't want you there, but yet they tell you about this person that called them that they're sending gift cards to and all these things. Well, guess what? When we're lonely and isolated for long enough times and our stress is kicked in, our system's just sort of out of whack, we can lose theory of mind, which is our ability to judge the intentions of other people. So all of a sudden, they may see you're the devil, but the person that's calling them that really, has great meaning for them and is going to do really great things for them. Only if they send them money, they find them to be super helpful and somebody they want to be friends with. And so all of this can lead to really poor health outcomes for us. Now, so what is the major link here? What's stress? And I really love Dr. Robert Sapolsky, out of Stanford, who does some really great work. He says, we live long enough to have the luxury to get ourselves sick with purely social and psychological stress. So a long time ago, we didn't have very long lifespans. It was rough, but as medicine has allowed us to live longer, more resources. Well, now what we're doing is we're dying of stress-related diseases. And loneliness is associated with morbidity and mortality through that sort of stress mechanism. And unfortunately, stress goes with us everywhere. I mean, I don't know how many people were like, oh, I got to get there. I'm going to be late for this meeting, and, traffic, and then, just the hustle and bustle of the day, that we take it off and we can't turn it off. And sometimes we can't find that off switch. We just sit there and we ruminate over these sorts of things. And people who are isolated and lonely, they stay on this sort of stress loop. All of a sudden, you can see why their brains may start changing, the behaviors start changing, and they may be doing things that are bad for their health and bad for their social connections. And so, what are some solutions? And I'll get to these quickly. I know we're going to run out of time here pretty quickly. But we have to create, improve, and scale up. So we need to create these sort of a commitment to doing this. And I think the Surgeon General's report, that was a statement of, hey, we're going to commit to this, and we need to improve the evidence base of what works to create social connections for our folks in our communities. But they need to be scalable, things that we can actually get out there and reach the most people. And I can tell you, with technology, it's great, but technology isn't always the answer. But one great thing is that we've got some models, like in the UK, they put a minister of loneliness in place. That person, that's their whole job in the UK, address loneliness in their society. It's such a big problem for them. Luckily enough, we have people like Eddie Garcia, who started the Foundation for Social Connection and the Coalition to End Social Isolation and Loneliness in the US, I think probably around 2019. And they are the folks that are really, that's all they do every day, is they try to figure out ways that they can build programs, build research, guide policy and practice so we can drive down the risk of social isolation and loneliness in the US. They're fostering evidence-based solutions for social connection, which is really great. And we're doing some work with them that I'll talk about in a second. But one thing that we can do, all of us, is to screen and respond. And screening is a response to this problem. We need to identify it so that we can get people to the places they need in order to get socially connected. One great paper that just came out, Dr. Holt-Lundstad, Dr. Precianoto, they're the leaders in this area, and they've come up with something that's really great. It's the EAR framework, which is basically you educate, if you're out there with an older adult, educate them on why it's important to stay socially connected, assess them to make sure that are they socially isolated, Are they lonely? What factors may be inhibiting them from having good social connections, and then try to respond to them, try to get them connected to some sort of volunteer program or help get them connected with their families or some other ways of getting them socially connected. There's some really easy scales you can use to measure for this stuff. The UCLA 3-item scale. It's really simple to use. How often do you feel left out? How often do you feel isolated? And how often do you lack companionship? And then you have some other measures like the Duke Social Support Index, which allows you to ask about, get that sort of quantifiable data on social isolation. So, really, I think what we need to consider is that we don't know all the answers, but we don't have to choose between being scientific and being compassionate. We need to do some screening on these folks and then do whatever we can to get them connected out in communities. And so there are some scalable solutions, some things that, there's this term called social prescribing now, which is what we're trying to push forward with students and our providers. Because one thing that I've heard in medicine is we don't know what to do about it. We can screen for it, but we don't know what to do about it. So therefore we don't screen for it. And I said, well, what do you do about domestic violence? What do you do about child abuse? And they go, oh, yeah, you got a good point. I'm like, yeah, screen for it and get them connected to somebody. Like that's the job. So but what we need to do is we need to have things out in our community that can meet the demand. And some things that we're doing here is we're connecting students. We're building programs so we connect students, and they can be these social engagement folks for older adults in our communities or anybody that's really socially isolated. It gives them some great experience with working with folks with different sort of health conditions, and it makes them see the person and not the disease as much. And so we're able to leverage these sort of partnerships. There's the AARP Friendly Voice. So you connect people to people through phone calls out in Colorado. They've got another program where they're connecting students with older adults through telecare. They've got a program out at UT Southwestern where they're connecting undergraduates with student or with older adults. And then what we're doing here in Houston, and the paper that I have here, that was just when we connected them with elder mistreatment survivors, but we're also doing it in some other areas, which I'll talk about in a second. But we learned some really great things whenever we paired students with our elder mistreatment survivors. What we found was that 90% of the elder mistreatment participants, they felt high levels of gratitude and meaningfulness in the calls. They felt like, they talked about times they contributed to society, so they're kind of speaking to their value when they like, hey, I used to be a valuable person. I used to do all these things. They got time to reminisce about those things, and they got to talk about, they look forward to the calls, and they also talked about their life, their hardships, and what they enjoyed. And what we found was that some of these older adults said, hey, you're a blessing because I've not talked to anyone after being isolated for the last 3 years. I only wanted to be loved before I died, and I feel loved. I mean, these are pretty profound statements that only came from phone calls once a week for 6 weeks. They lasted about up to 39 minutes at a time. The medical students say, oh, she laughed a lot and told me how much she enjoys our talks. It was nice to hear her happy. And they also talked about how they learned about, that these people don't need things that are much different than what the students need. They said, hey, we're maybe generations different, but we're pretty much the same in terms of we need people in our life. We want people to talk to, we want to feel loved, and therefore we'll treat them with integrity as I move through my health profession. And so what I did is I leveraged that, and now we have a statewide study where we are using elder mistreatment, self-neglect clients for adult protective services, connecting them with students across different universities here in Houston, including 5 schools at UT. And then what we do is we do a step care social and mental health engagement program where the students will engage these folks in conversation via telephone and just be a social connection for them. And if they detect any sort of mental distress, they'll screen for it a little bit. And then what they'll do is they'll refer them over to our trauma and resilience center to get them some mental health treatment if they are agreeable. Another thing that we're doing is we have students that are connecting with our stroke survivors to be social connections with them as well. And we have about 13 or 14 people enrolled in that pilot study, so we're seeing some really great benefits there. Another thing we're doing is we're taking students and peers, your peers to the older adult, and we've created something called the Carmel B. Dyer Second Family Program with Care Partners of Houston. It was funded by elderabuse.org, and it's all about getting out there, being a social connection, being a support system for these older adults that are living alone in our community in Houston with either Alzheimer's disease or not. They don't have to have it, but we're trying to keep them socially connected. And then we also have a program where we're taking medical students and we're taking them into nursing homes to be social connections for older adults living in underserved nursing homes in Houston. That's a pilot study funded through the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services. And so we're really excited about that. Hopefully they're going to take that nationwide, depending on how this pilot goes. Then another thing you can do is you just get folks, volunteering creates a huge change for people. It gives them what we consider sort of meaning and purpose, and it's shown to be really beneficial for their social isolation and loneliness. And really, I really love this phrase, this quote: "He who has a why to live for can bear almost any how." That's really, really a true statement. We can endure a lot. We can endure sort of the loss of family and all these things as long as we have some reason to go on. And when we're socially isolated, socially connected, oftentimes we don't have that. We don't have that meaning. We don't have that purpose. And so we'll sit there and we'll end up in a very bad situation. And I just sort of, you sort of see these themes throughout, a lot of areas in books and songs and writings. And I just wanted to point out, I don't know if you ever heard the lyrics of Jolene by Ray LaMontagne, but he says, "It's been so long since I've seen your face. I felt a part of the human race." So here he's talking about, I've been disconnected. I've been away. I've been living out of this here suitcase, and man needs something he can hold on to, a 9-pound hammer, or a woman like you. He needs a job. He needs a person, needs something to live for. And I think that's what a lot of our folks in our communities, older folks that are isolated alone, need, and we can give it to them in a lot of different ways that are scalable, can reach them. And I think I'm out of time, so I can't go through this little picture perfect life story, but if you're interested, I'll share it with you externally. But just sort of some takeaways: social disconnection is a huge problem. It's detrimental to our health. We need to address it, and it can be done in many forms, with some of the most effective ways being good old-fashioned conversations. And each and every community has a capacity to address this. We need to raise awareness, screen, provide some social connection for our aging members. And with that, I will stop. I think I'm a little bit over time, so I want to thank you all for sticking around. And if you have any more questions for me, please call me, email me, and we'll connect and talk about this some more. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was a really great presentation. We have like 6 minutes left. So if there are any questions, and if we don't get to them, I'm sure, Dr. Burnett's contact information was there, but if you didn't get it, you can feel free to email me, and I'm sure I can get those questions answered. I'll put my email in the chat as well, and the hotline number. Are there any questions? Oh, there's a question. Do you recommend we encourage our parents to be more socially active when they don't want to? How do we deal with this resistance?
I think part of it is sort of the awareness, just bringing up that, hey, this, like, give them the Surgeon General's report and say, hey, take a look at them. I'm not making it up. I'm not just trying to force something on you. This is really an epidemic. It's a problem. It causes health problems, and I don't want that for you. I don't think you want that for you. And and it's the staying connected or being connected is an easy way to avoid some of these problems. And we can't force anybody to do it, but maybe just reaching out to them, every so often, and keeping that sort of foot in the door. It's a tough one, but I think awareness goes a long ways.
Is it okay if I share your email again in the chat?
Absolutely.
Because I think some people want your PowerPoint, but you weren't able to get it to me. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that. And then
I think somebody said they want to hear the story.
yes, somebody says they want to hear the story.
So I can tell the story really quickly. I'll give an abbreviated version. So it's a great story about social connection. It's heartbreaking, heartwarming at the same time. So went out and I was doing interviews with adult protective services clients who are validated for self-neglect, because I want to understand the interplay of social isolation and loneliness in that population and figure out if we can do things for them. And I'll tell you, sort of sneak peek, is they all said, yes, I want to be connected with somebody, which is great. And we're going to work on doing that. But this one gentleman I went out and visited with, it was fascinating. So I went out there and you walk into the house and you see this huge picture, frame picture of this person up on this big speaker. And I mean, she's got this huge smile on her face and this big red dress and big red hat. And I get to talking to the gentleman. And I mean, he's like, this guy has the demeanor of like, he could calm any storm. Like really, he's just super cool, relaxed. And he starts telling me about how all his health conditions and things that he's having to manage, and how, he's spent most of his life in prison, and he would look up at that photo and he would get sort of, as I'm asking questions about social connection, isolation, he'd look up at that photo and he would just sort of tear up. He'd say, well, all my family are gone, all my friends are gone. And then he would look up and say, well, I miss you, mama. I love you. And so I was like, oh, so what I learned was that was his grandmother. He'd grown up in this house for 71 years. And being in and out of prison, he said, my grandparents, and that's who he considered mama, was his grandparent. And he said, I could call them anytime. They would want to know what I was doing, how I was doing. He said it didn't matter, but they couldn't get me to do good. He said I just couldn't do good. I wanted to do all this. He said, so I went to prison, was in and out. Said finally they told me I was going to get out, and I didn't believe them. I come home, they put me in a cabinet, send me here, and when I get here, the house is overgrown. His wife at the time, his daughter, and his grandmother were living there. Gets there and house overgrown. He finally gets in. He said nothing was taken care of. He goes in, rats, roaches everywhere, just very deplorable situation. His wife's gone, his daughter's gone, but he finds mama. He says, mama, where's my wife? Where's my kid? She says, I don't know. I don't know. He's like, well, why didn't you go with them? And she said, well, baby, I was afraid that if I left, you wouldn't be able to find your way home. And I was like, whoa. And so he said at that moment, he said, that told me, he said, I decided I wasn't going back to prison because I had to be here to take care of mama from this life to the next, who already had to start developing dementia. So he did that. And now, even with his ailing health, he takes care of an 88-year-old woman in his neighborhood who has advanced dementia, leaves his house every night, goes down there, stays with her, so she don't wonder, stays awake all night to watch her, comes home every day, goes, walks through his house and make sure that nothing's missing. He's like, so I just come here, look around, and I go to sleep. And so here's a guy who is doing this, gets called for self-neglect, when I think it's probably actually he's just selfless. Right, and then he talks about giving so much to other people. And we asked him, well, how, if you could increase, very lonely, very isolated. But I said, if you could increase improve your social life, what would it be? He said, oh, if I won the lottery, I could, I could give other people who don't have anything something. And I was like, okay. So I mean, so this guy, he finds so much meaning in his life. He deals with social isolation, loneliness, all his health, because he has meaning. And I think it really all boiled down from that connection with his grandmother, who said, look, she instilled that sort of connection in him, and that's what changed him at that point in his life. And it's just a profound story It was just an amazing person who, you know, I just worry that at some point he's gonna end up like mama and nobody's gonna check on him, or they're gonna tuck him away in some nursing home. We're not ever gonna hear his story. So getting it out there in multiple ways, but very interesting story.
Thank you so much for sharing that. That was a really great story. I see in the chat a lot of people, you know, it's touched, you know, several people. We are out of time, unfortunately. And so if you do have any questions, can they email you? Is that okay?
Absolutely.
Okay, I already shared your email in the chat. So thank you so much for presenting. It was a really fascinating and important topic. And thanks for, you know, thanks. And thank you to everybody who attended our last webinar of Older Americans Month. You know, check out our website for future events and call the hotline if anybody needs a healthcare tracker.
Yeah,
Okay,
shoot me an email, give me a call, whatever y'all want.
All right. Thanks for attending, everyone. And Angel just sent our email list if anybody's interested in joining. If not, I'm going to end the presentation. Thank you so much. Everybody have a great rest of your day.
Yep, thank you. Bye-bye.